It was a cold, foggy evening in the quiet town of Ravenswood. The streets were nearly empty, and the gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the cobblestone roads. In a small, dimly lit office above the bakery, Detective Arthur Gray sat at his desk, sipping a cup of steaming tea. His sharp eyes scanned the latest newspaper, but his mind was elsewhere. He was waiting for something or someone. A loud knock on the door broke the silence. Detective Gray straightened his tie and called out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped inside. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, and her face was pale with worry. In her hands, she clutched a small copper compass. "Detective Gray," she began, her voice trembling, "I need your help. My father has disappeared, and this compass, it's the only clue I have." Detective Gray gestured for her to sit down. "Please tell me everything." The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Hart. Her father, Professor Samuel Hart, was a renowned historian who'd been studying ancient artifacts. A week ago, he had gone to Ravenswood Manor, the home of Lord Blackwood, to examine a rare collection of relics. He never returned. "This compass," Eleanor said, placing it on the desk, "was my father's most prized possession. He always carried it with him. But when I went to Ravenswood Manor to look for him, I found it lying on the floor of the library. There was no sign of my father, and Lord Blackwood claims he never arrived." Detective Gray picked up the compass. It was old, with intricate engravings on its copper surface. The needle spun wildly, as if it couldn't find its direction. "This is no ordinary compass," Gray muttered. "Tell me, did your father mention anything unusual about his work recently?" Eleanor hesitated. "He did say something about a hidden treasure, a secret that could change history. But he was very vague about it. I thought he was just being his usual mysterious self." Detective Gray stood up. "I think it's time I paid a visit to Ravenswood Manor." Ravenswood Manor was a sprawling Gothic estate on the outskirts of town. Its tall towers loomed against the dark sky, and the gates creaked ominously as Detective Gray and Eleanor approached. A stern-looking butler greeted them at the door and led them to the library, where Lord Blackwood was waiting. Lord Blackwood was a tall, imposing man with a sharp gaze. He greeted them with a polite but cold smile. "Detective Gray, Miss Hart, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "We're here about Professor Hart," Gray said, getting straight to the point. "His daughter is concerned about his disappearance." Lord Blackwood's expression didn't change. "As I told Miss Hart, I never saw her father. He never arrived at the manor." Detective Gray glanced around the library. It was filled with ancient books, maps, and artifacts. His eyes fell on a large, ornate globe in the corner. The needle of the copper compass in his pocket began to spin faster. "May I ask what you and Professor Hart were working on?" Gray inquired. Lord Blackwood hesitated. "We were studying a collection of ancient maps. Professor Hart believed they held the key to a long-lost treasure. But I assure you, his disappearance has nothing to do with me." Detective Gray wasn't convinced. He excused himself and began to explore the library, pretending to admire the artifacts. As he approached the globe, the compass in his pocket grew warm. He discreetly pulled it out and noticed that the needle was now pointing directly at the globe. "Interesting," Gray muttered. He examined the globe closely and found a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a piece of parchment with a series of cryptic symbols. Lord Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" Detective Gray held up the parchment. "Care to explain this?" Lord Blackwood's calm demeanor shattered. "That's none of your business." Before Gray could react, Lord Blackwood lunged at him, trying to grab the parchment. A struggle ensued, but Gray was quick. He managed to subdue Lord Blackwood with a well-placed punch. Eleanor rushed to Gray's side. "What's going on?" "Your father discovered something important," Gray explained. "Something Lord Blackwood didn't want anyone else to know." With the help of the copper compass and the parchment, Detective Gray and Eleanor deciphered the clues. They led to a hidden chamber beneath the manor, where they found Professor Hart, unharmed but trapped. "Father!" Eleanor cried, rushing to his side. Professor Hart smiled weakly. "I knew you'd find me, Eleanor." The compass, it was the key. Lord Blackwood was arrested, and the treasure, a collection of priceless historical artifacts, was recovered. As for the copper compass, it had served its purpose. The needle finally stopped spinning, pointing true north once more. Back in his office, Detective Gray sat at his desk, reflecting on the case. The fog outside had lifted, and the streets of Ravenswood were quiet once again. He picked up the compass and smiled. "Another mystery solved," he said to himself, placing the compass in his drawer. "But something tells me this won't be the last." And with that, Detective Arthur Gray leaned back in his chair, ready for the next case to come his way.